Yay.
Good morning!
Good morning.
How's everybody this morning?
Wonderful.
Are we excited to go deeper and deeper into the contracts? We're now on session number 3 of the contracts, right?
Yes.
Okay. You should all have your copies. I think we got that straightened out. Thank you, Mary. So everybody has a copy of the contract so you can follow along, because sometimes it's not so easy to follow along on the screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about, before we get into the contracts again, let's talk about one thing real quick. As a relatively new agent, you have to understand that sometimes you're going to experience some things that might make you feel like this business is futile. Okay? So we had an agent who had an experience the other day, and I want to share it with you so that you understand that when this happens to you, notice I didn't say if, I said when. When this happens to you, I want you to be prepared to deal with it and understand how to process it, okay? Because honestly, she didn't do anything wrong, but she lost a contract, okay? So she held an open house, which is, as a new agent, a good thing to do, right? She had a buyer come in and unrepresented and liked the house. She sold them on the house. They said, yes, we want to make an offer. She went through the process, wrote an offer with them. They were a cash buyer. They were liquidating funds. So they didn't have a proof of funds, which honestly is not always surprising in that situation. I mean, if you're buying a multiple $100,000 house, most people don't have that kind of money sitting in a checking account just ready to go at any moment. Okay? They have to pull it from somewhere. But, you know, so it takes process. Got under contract, negotiated the offer back and forth with some counter offers, and then the buyer went silent. What could she have done differently to keep the buyer from going silent? Anything?
Well, I mean, you attempt to communicate with them, but if they're not communicating
Right.
back,
I mean, obviously she called, email, text, and got nothing.
Did she have an agreement with her?
She did. So it was just a
Maybe
case.
she could have got the earnest money up front.
Well, so from that standpoint, she did write into the contract that the earnest money was due X number of days after the binding agreement date. So maybe that would have. She could have done a thorough background search on the gentleman. She could have Googled him. She could have asked him for his, Social Security number and asked him for his private banker and dug deep into his life. She could have gone with the gut feeling of, ooh, this is a little shaky, I shouldn't do this. Or she should have done what she did, which was try to move forward with the contract as best as she could, because you never know. So I don't know if I've told the story in this class, but I'm going to tell it again. The story of the cowboy and the pickup truck. Anybody heard that? Okay. So in Beverly Hills, there was a real estate office, and a gentleman pulls up in front in what looks to be a pickup truck that's been in a derby. It's beaten, rusted, old, horrible. As he gets out of the truck, dust drops from his clothes, and as he walks, there's a little bit of dust that drops off as he walks into this high-end office in Beverly Hills. And he inquires about a multiple million, because there isn't anything else, right? Multiple $1 million listing around the corner, and says he wants to pay cash and buy it. Now the agents in there went with their gut and went with their feelings and their stereotypes, and they said, this guy doesn't have enough money to buy the grass in front of this house, much less the actual house. Forget about it. And they ran him off, basically. So he's, all right, whatever. Back in his pickup truck, drove a couple blocks down the street to another real estate office, walked in. Same thing, inquiring about this house around the corner. I'd really like to know, I'd like to buy it, I think. I'd like to go see it. I'm a cash buyer. And the agent said, okay, great, let's go do it. They went and showed it. Lo and behold, he bought the house. Then he proceeded to write a letter to the owner of the previous brokerage and explain that they had just missed on a rather large commission check because his agents chose not to work with him based on his appearance. In this business, there are so many different reasons why we think. And they can be legitimate reasons, they can be non-legitimate reasons. But the reality is that we cannot judge anyone because you never know what they may be. Now, there's a difference between not judging people and not taking safety precautions. Okay, so don't think that I'm saying that. If you don't know somebody and they want you to meet them at a house at 9 o'clock at night to show a property, should you go by yourself and do that? No, that's probably not a good idea. You have to determine for yourself what your policy is on how you protect yourself and how you work, what your comfort level is. Every one of us has a different level of threshold and a level of risk that we're willing to put ourselves in. I mean, every day we get up, we walk out the front door, we're putting ourselves at risk somewhat. But there are different ways to mitigate that. And so you have to decide. You meet all your clients at the office. Do you take copies of their driver's license? Do you make sure that you only go to properties with pre-approved people or with proof of funds? What are the levels that you push? The reality is that if you are so controlling in that, well, I won't work with anyone that hasn't given me their social security number, their picture ID, their proof of funds, and the this and the that and the other, all this stuff, you may run off clients. So you have to do a balance, but you have to make sure that you feel comfortable and you feel safe. Okay? Any comments about that process before we get going?
Well, in the case in which the buyer goes silent, what vetting had that agent done?
Other than discussions with the client, there weren't any.
So there has to be more than nothing and less than a full forensic exam.
Exactly. And so it's a balance. And, you know, I mean, I tend to Google people just to kind of whatever.
That's me.
I think there's nothing, you know, I think you can find out a lot of stuff. And if there's something horribly blatant, usually it comes up. I tend to lean on the side of it's good to meet clients at the office versus running out and meeting them at vacant properties because that makes me nervous. But, you know, it's a personal choice. You know, it's kind of like what parts of town do you work? Well, as an agent, I worked all parts of town where other people were afraid to go. But it was fine because I was comfortable there. And so you have to decide where you're comfortable and what you're comfortable doing. But the key is that you have to treat everyone the same. Okay? So if your policy is that you get copies of driver's license before you go out on buyer tours, you better get from everybody, not just the people that creep you out. Because that's a violation of fair housing. Okay? So make sure that you're doing consistency. All right, let's get into contracts. This is the fun stuff. All right, so we have, to review real quick, we have done the entire front page, right? We've filled out all the blocks and everything, and we've gotten through, and we're all the way down to now the corresponding paragraphs for Section A. So we finished Section A, and we're moving into the rest. I'm going to preface this with it is not a plug, but if you want to know more about contracts than anyone else in the world, get this book and read it. This is written by the person that helps write the contracts. He's the attorney for the Georgia Association of Realtors, and this is the book on how to understand the contract. It is basically the textbook, and it is really, really fine print, and it's really, really dry, and it's really, really long. But if you want to understand anything and everything about the contract, that's it.
It's got a good beat and dance to it.
Yes, it does. It is. So let's go through and start in on page 2 of the contract and see how far we can get today. I'm hoping maybe we can get through the whole boilerplate section if we can go through that. But please ask questions as we go through, because I know if you have questions, other people will have questions. It's the same. So let's get started. Purchase and sale title. What is the warranty? What does that mean? Here's the first question. The first question is the front page you obviously had to read as you went through and filled it out, right? And the next page that you actually have to write something on is like page 6. So my question is what about pages 2, 3, 4, and 5? Should you read those?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, which is kind of what we're doing. The purchase and sale title, the warranty is the seller's warranty of the title. In other words, their comment that they do actually own the property and have the right to sell it to you, right? My attorney in the back, you can correct me if I'm completely wrong on anything. It talks about different specific things that it's subject to, like zoning and general utilities and all those sorts of things. And this is the part that when people ask, well, what about these other contracts that are out there? Why, you know, an agent gives me an offer on a different contract that's not a GAR form. Why shouldn't I use it? This paragraph, these sets of paragraphs, I think from what I've been told by the attorneys, because remember I'm not an attorney and so this is just me evaluating this as a broker, is this is one of the biggest holes in the other contracts, is the level of warranty. And so it is important that we understand that you're going to get good marketable title in the purchase price. Now we've had a run lately on buyers that are concerned about that, which has been interesting. And so we just kind of refer them back to this paragraph. They keep saying things like, well, we want to make sure that we have time to inspect the title. It's built into the contract that they're going to provide us marketable title. Not to mention during due diligence, you should be able to get the attorney to get the title search done and back to you. I mean, Mo, you're talking about 5 days, right? Not 2 hours. No, we had one the other day. I've got an hour before this auction closes. Can I get a title search then? No, probably not. So,
Hey, you gotta ask.
So if you go to closing and you close on a property and they find there's a cloud on title, you can go back and sue the attorney, the closing attorney, for not just doing.
well, there's title
diligence.
insurance
Title insurance?
that
They'll cover
covers
that.
that sort of thing.
Okay.
So yes, but to that extent, you do want to use a good attorney with a good title company because that's where that liability kind of falls. And if they don't, if they're not doing a good, thorough search, then it could cause you issues later for sure. I mean, even title insurance is great. You might get your money back, but you're probably not going to get the house, which is what you wanted. So
They will have spent a lot on.
and you'll moved in, you'll have, I mean, there's definitely a lot of out-of-pocket costs that you're probably not getting back. So, all right, survey number 2. Notwithstanding anything in provisions, blah blah blah. The survey term material different is defined in here. When should a buyer get a survey? Or here's a question: when should a buyer not get a survey?
Never.
What's a condo? I mean, if it's a piece of land, you need a survey. You got to know where it is. Okay? So I highly recommend it if you use the brochures that we've talked a little bit about, but we're going to go into deeper. They're referring buyers to take and get a survey. Okay?
How much is a survey?
Typically in the $300-400 range, depending on how big the property is. Typical residential lots, $300-400. Obviously, if it's a large tract of land, that can go up rather quickly. Okay. Next one, number 3, is purchase price and method of payment. In this contract, does it matter if the person is getting a loan, bringing cash, counting pennies, whatever? Not at all.
No.
Because this contract is by default a cash contract.
Mm-hmm.
Because even if you're getting financing, are you going to pay the seller as the buyer with a document, or are you going to pay them with money?
Yeah.
Money, right? The lender is going to wire funds. So in all reality, this contract is a cash contract no matter what. Because at the end of the day, at closing, there's going to be a transfer of actual funds. And that's basically what this says. It basically says cash or its equivalent shall only include the wire transfer of immediately available funds or cashier's check issued before the closing by a federally insured bank, savings and loan association, or credit union where the funds are immediately available. I will tell you that most closing attorneys will not accept cashier's checks. Wire transfers are the way to go because the amount of money is too much and there's been fraud with cashier's checks. So I would be surprised if in the next iterations of the contract if that doesn't come out because it's been an issue of late. So, it used to be attorneys would take personal checks at closings for certain amounts. These days, it has to be a very special circumstance for them to accept a personal check, and it needs to be a very small amount of money, something that the attorney is basically willing to lose, because that's kind of the effect of that. All right, let's go through closing cost and prorations. This is an important section to understand. Items paid by the buyer. The buyer pays the Georgia property transfer tax, the cost to search title and tax records, prepare the warranty deed, and all other costs, fees, and charges to close the transaction, except as they relate to the clearance of title encumbrances and/or defects necessary for the seller to be able to convey good and marketable title to the property. So basically, any cost that isn't related to clearing up a title issue is the buyer's cost. We've talked about this before. Let's go back and see if you remember.
3 to 5% or something.
2 to 3%.
2 to 3%.
Okay. 2 to 3% is typically, but make sure that you look at those good faith estimates from the lenders because sometimes other programs can be significantly more expensive. And if you throw into the mix that it's a condo with a high condo association fee and initiation fees and things like that, it can start to add up real fast. It can definitely get above 3%. All right, items paid by the seller. Seller at closing shall make the reference seller's monetary contribution which buyer may use to pay any cost or expense the buyer related to this transaction. This is a very important sentence. It says, buyer acknowledges that buyer's mortgage lender may not allow the seller's monetary contribution or full amount thereof to be used for some costs or expenses. In such an event, any unused portion of the seller's monetary contribution shall remain the property of the seller. In addition, seller shall pay all costs, fees necessary to clear title, encumbrances, so on and so on. And the cost if they can't close in person. So if the seller can't be there, they have to pay for that, obviously, because that's their issue. But it's pretty important to understand that sentence says that if the lender has a cap on the percentage or the amount of closing costs, the seller gets that money back. So you need to know what that is going into the contract.
Unless there's a rider attached to the contract, in which case it can reduce the sale price, theoretically.
It could, but more than likely that's going to cause all kinds of turbulence with the lender at the end of the day. So, because now we're reducing the sales price and they have to rerun all their packages and all kinds of stuff. So be wary of that.
Okay, so what you're saying is if they had said we will cover closing cost up to $5,000, closing cost was $4,000, then the seller keeps the extra $1,000, and you're saying if there was a rider, maybe it would reduce the price $1,000, but you're saying that would be.
You could. No, you absolutely could do that.
But the lender would have to know about it.
But the lender would have to understand that and be prepared for that, and you'd have to know it. The problem is you'd have to know it pretty early on, so that the lender wasn't having to redo the package,
While you're
24 hours while you're saying, I mean, that's
Right,
not
but
gonna
then again, if that's the contract and it's submitted to the lender
Then
and
they
the
are-
lender doesn't know it, that's their
that's their issue.
negligence.
Yes, but that is part of our issue too, unfortunately.
Right, because we don't get paid that if it doesn't close.
Right. So it's pretty important to understand how much money your buyer needs to pay, and pretty important to know what that money can be used for. Basically, it can be used for anything. That you can, if the lender will allow it, You can use it to prepay prorations and escrows and all kinds of things that it can be used for. The trick is that you have to, the lender usually controls that. All right. Proration, speaking of. What's a proration?
Percentage of
Split,
based
right?
on time, yeah.
My part as a seller for the part that I own the property, and your part as the buyer and the part that you own the property. That's the basics of it. It, you know, can be relatively complicated in the calculations of it. If you remember back to your license course, pre-license course, that was one of the big things, right? How many days and calculating out in 360 or 365 or, all that stuff, right? So you've got to understand all the things, obviously property taxes, community association fees, utility bills if there aren't, terminated, those sorts of things get processed through here. You also want to read the specific language in here about tax bills. Because what if the tax bill is being challenged by the seller and then they sell in the middle of that challenge? So read the language and make sure you understand how that might work out. If you have questions about something like that and that comes up, who do you ask?
Lawyer.
A lawyer. Not me. Lawyer. That's deeper than my pay grade. I don't have that degree. So we want to go deep into it and ask, well, what's going on in this situation? What are the options? The other thing you have to take into consideration is the lenders with prorations. So, for instance, when I bought my home, the year that I bought my home, there were absolutely no state taxes on it. No property tax. Because the gentleman's wife had passed away, and a Georgia law is that you get to opt out of property tax for a year if you have a spouse pass away, if it's your only main asset. Okay? So, unfortunately, the lender can really understand how to deal with that. And so you can imagine it has taken, 3 years, a little over 3 years in the house at this point, and my escrow account is still doing this. Because they took too much money the first year, because obviously they didn't have a bill to pay, and they realized they just didn't believe that, as much as we documented. Then the next year, of course, they refunded a bunch and recalculated based on the fact that they didn't have any, and then, of course, we were short.
Oh, goodness.
And then the next year, it's just been. So just be aware that the lender plays a big role in understanding those prorations as well, if there's a lender involved. So pay attention to those. All right, next section, closing and possession. Very important. Very important. Remember when we talked about the box on the front about possession? If you just put a date in that box, when is possession?
Midnight, by midnight on that day, 11:59 p.m.
It's if you put possession is, because let's go back to the box. Seller retains possession of property through whatever date. Then they retain possession for that whole day, right? And your buyer doesn't get that property until midnight. Anybody want to get up at midnight and do a key exchange?
No.
Not usually, right? So it's very important that you have something that has a timeline related to it in that section. Under possessions, this gives us the right. This section gives us the right. This is the part that talks about the unilateral 7-day extension. Okay? You want to read this language very specifically because, for instance, if I have a buyer that for some reason their cash money it's going to take them an extra couple of days to get that out, to do the down payment, can I do a 7-day unilateral? Nope. I cannot. Because as the buyer, I warranted that I had those funds available. And so if I don't, that's not a reason to be able to extend the contract. There are two reasons to extend the contract. The seller can extend the contract unilaterally if there's a title issue. If something comes up there, the lien pops up that's wrong or right or whatever at the last minute, and they need time to get that cleared up, they can extend the contract for 7 days. The only reason the buyer can extend the contract is due to a lender delay. So if it's a cash contract, it's not financed, can you use a unilateral extension as a buyer?
No lender.
Because there's no lender, right? And the lender is the only one that can cause that. Okay? All right. Now, here's the funny part. I want to ask why this says this. Buyer's mortgage lender, if any, including in all cash transactions, or the closing attorney cannot fulfill their respective obligations by the date of the closing. So technically, if the closing attorney can't get their stuff together, then that's a delay reason too. That's not usually the case, so I don't usually run into that one. But what's this paragraph in here about, or sentence in here about all cash transactions? Why is it including an all cash transaction?
Because there can be extenuating circumstances beyond the control of the buyer.
No,
Because it says buyer's mortgage lender, if any, including in all, quote, all cash transactions.
Oh, because everything is cash.
Because just because you don't have a finance contingency doesn't mean you can't get a loan. Okay? And we haven't gotten to the contingencies, but understand that by putting in a finance contingency, that is saying, okay, I want the right to have this loan and these requirements, and we'll go through those. But if you say that it's an all-cash transaction, it doesn't mean you can't go get a loan. And so if you are in the process of getting a loan, even if you don't have a finance contingency, if there's a delay from your now lender, that can be a legitimate reason to do a 7-day extension. Okay? So obviously, if it's a true cash transaction, there's not a lender. But if there is a lender, then that's a legitimate reason, whether you have a finance contingency or not.
Well, I was referencing the next clause, provided delay is not caused by the buyer.
Correct, yes, and that's also the case. You can't, if you just haven't bothered to get your documents back to your lender because you were on vacation or you were busy, you can't do unilateral extension. It has to be the lender's fault. Okay?
Right, or if there's an all-cash transaction and somehow the buyer's bank makes a mistake.
True, could be, and that could
And
happen.
it's not the buyer's fault.
We actually have run into that. We did use that once, and they allowed us to. I don't know that it was 100%, but let's go with everybody agreed to it. We had a buyer who had their funds in Europe, and in transferring their funds to the U.S., they found that their bank had a limit of $60,000 a day. Well, this was a $600,000 house. Luckily, they had some, but it wasn't until about 2 or 3 days before closing that they started realizing that this was not going to work. That they needed to, and so we had to use unilateral to get us some more time, because this bank had policies and rules that they would not transfer more than $60,000 at a time per day.
Well, the buyer's mistake in not having that information.
It is somewhat the buyer's fault, and that's why the unilateral is a little iffy, but it really, it wasn't necessarily something that you could have foreseen. It was cash. It wasn't like it was any kind of investment account or other, things that we would normally think had rules and regulations. I mean, it was just in, an account. It wasn't locked up in some other kind of...
Is there a requirement that close that the buyer deposit into escrow all the cash available up until that point?
No, they didn't make us do that. No.
Because that could have been like
they just
a way
transferred. I think what they did is actually they were transferring the money directly to the attorney as it came in, just so that they didn't have to go through another transaction.
So can a buyer, write a contract, offer to purchase, all cash, and then once they go binding, then decide to go out and get a loan?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Because remember, the purchase method is money
Okay. Yeah, it's also-
at closing.
So it doesn't really
Whether the
matter.
money comes from you or
Yeah.
someone else
Doesn't really
is
matter.
somewhat irrelevant to the
Right.
seller.
As long as it's there on the closing table.
Correct. Now, they wouldn't have any of the protections of a finance contingency. We'll talk about that, but
Okay.
they do have the right to get the money from anywhere. I mean, if they want to go down the street and get Guido to give it to them, it might not be the best idea, but it's possible.
Hey,
Or
get
Or
five.
Tony. Or Tony.
Has the $60,000 money lender.
Yes, no, yeah. I mean, it's designed to try and protect, criminal against criminal activity. But it's not something a normal person necessarily knows.
It's like if somebody comes in with a transaction in excess of $10,000 cash, has to be reported.
Right.
to-
Fingerprinted and all kinds of stuff. It's fun. I've done it. All right. Next paragraph, subparagraph is keys and openers. This one is important. All right. This one gets overlooked a lot. But at closing, the seller shall provide the buyer with all keys, door openers, codes, and other similar equipment pertaining to the property. Does it say all keys that I have? All keys that I know about? It just says all keys, right? So if they don't have a garage door opener and the garage door has a garage door, automatic opener,
Can't close.
I mean, technically a buyer could balk at that, right?
Pull the
Because
plug.
it says you're going to provide me with the door openers.
Right.
And this is an automatic door. Where's the door opener?
It's that little button up at the top. You have to reprogram.
It's in my car on the rear view mirror. So this one I think is a little vague, but and it can cause issues. So it's pretty important to kind of look through that to begin with. A lot of times in the disclosures, people accurately report if they don't have, and so you know ahead of time. But it is the kind of thing that you need to know. If you're the listing agent, you go to the closing, and the seller says, "Oh, I just have the one key. What, can you stop and get everything?" You've got to work that out, okay? Worst thing I've ever seen, if you're in a closing and the buyer leaves the closing having bought the house and has no way to get in the house, they are not happy, right? And technically, the seller's in breach of contract. So you, as their agent, as the listing agent, need to make sure that that's taken care of and that keys are being transferred. Now, a lot of times people don't bring the whole bag of, I got a oversized Ziploc bag full of keys. I must have 30 keys in it. I don't even know where they all go to. But we got one key at closing, and the bag was in the house. Okay, so you can leave them all in the kitchen drawer and all that kind of stuff. But they have to have some way to get in the house. Yeah. And as a listing agent, you can't just say, "Oh, well, the lockbox is still on the front door. Your agent can let you in." Right? Because this is at closing. Not, well, if somebody goes with you, then you can go in and get in. So just be aware of that. Pay attention to that. Holder of earnest money. This is an important one. Holder of earnest money. We talked about who should hold earnest money and why attorneys shouldn't hold earnest money, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the paragraph that says that earnest money should be deposited in the holder's earnest money account, escrow account, whatever, not later than 5 banking days after the binding agreement, or 5 banking days after the days actually received if it is received after the binding agreement date. Which is why it's so important when you get an earnest money check that you turn it into the office immediately. And that if you get a contract, that you turn it in to the office immediately so that we can process it and get it deposited. Because we don't want you to be in breach of contract. The other side of that is if you already have something that's under contract and the earnest money is coming in a week later because of the way the contract's written, which is viable and fine, when you turn in that earnest money, just say, "Hey, this one needs to be deposited right away. It's already under contract." Not, "Okay, here's an earnest money check, put in the box." Because sometimes, we're human, and so let's focus on trying to help everybody do the right thing.
So is the account that the earnest money is deposited into, is that a interest-bearing account or not? Probably not.
When we get into special steps, we'll talk about that. Okay? Because we actually have a whole special step that talks about that for us. The rest of this paragraph talks about what happens if the money bounces, basically, right? It's important that you know, because that can happen. And so you have to know how to react to that and how to deal with it. They have 3 banking days to cure the default and get us more money. The seller has 7 days to terminate after the buyer notice. If they don't terminate, they waive their termination right. So, in theory, I could write you a $1,000 check. It could bounce. You could tell me, hey, it's bounced. You can't do it. And the seller could not say anything. And if 7 days go by, then can the seller kill the contract because there's no earnest money? No. And now there's no earnest money in the contract. Now, the odd thing is that the contract still says there's earnest money, and so the notification is going to have to be done to make sure that everybody's aware, which is part of this paragraph. So make sure you read it closely.
Question.
Mhm.
So the 7 days is from the time that they are notified of the default.
Correct.
Okay.
So the both times start at the same time. Here's notification. Buyer has 3 days to fix it, and the seller has 7 days to terminate.
What determines the date of notification?
When the seller gives notice, or when the holder gives notice to everyone that the money has been returned or whatever.
And there is also, I noticed, there's nothing that requires the holder of the escrow to notify whether the default has been cured. I mean,
No, there's not. I mean, yeah, no, there's not.
So the time clock starts running on the same time for the 3-day and the 7-day? Okay.
They're both from the time of notice.
Okay.
Okay? All right. Closing law firm. If the buyer is given the right to select a law firm from a mortgage lender's approved list of closing attorney, buyer agrees to select the law firm referenced in this agreement. When we were on the first page and we filled out the closing attorney, I mean, we were picking the closing attorney, right? Not necessarily. Okay. This is where it's important to read all this boilerplate language, because what you write is not necessarily what's going to happen. Because if for some reason that lender doesn't like to use XYZ attorney, they can say that attorney is not on our approved list, so therefore it is not an option, and you must use this one or whatever. But if that attorney is on the list, then we're good to go. And we have to use the one that's named in the contract. Right? A little weird, but you got to understand that's how it works. Who drives the contract? The lender in this case.
I just ran into a situation where the listing agent insists that you use a certain attorney to close the property. Is that within RESPA?
Insist and
Suggest?
require are two different
But they're
things.
kind of like,
They can be very adamant about it,
right.
and they can ask all they want. But
it's,
at the end of the day, it's a negotiable item.
it's a RESPA violation, right?
Well, I mean,
Railroading into to use
it's
the
actually
person?
could potentially a breach of fiduciary duty on the part of
Could
the
be.
agent.
yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of issues with that.
Okay.
But the reality is that the buyer always has the right to choose, but it is a negotiable contract. So if the seller wants to choose and something else is more important, excuse me, to the buyer, then they could give up that choice and let the seller choose. The times when we see that really come into play are
Short sales.
foreclosures and
Sure.
short sales.
That's all right. Those are short sale, actually.
Short sales, the reality of the short sale is that that attorney has probably done a ton of work already on that file,
Right.
and so it's really kind of the right thing to do to let them
Right.
close it, because they probably didn't get paid yet. And so for us to use them as the closing
Yeah.
allows them to get paid for all the work that they did to begin with.
Rather than jump ship and start with a new guy.
And from the standpoint of if they were involved in the understanding of the short sale, they're already up to speed, and so the
Right.
process is going to be a little easier than if you go to an attorney that has to start over. Okay.
Makes
So
sense.
you know, I
Makes
mean,
sense,
it's you're looking at what's in the best interest of your client,
Right.
whether you're a buyer or seller, and so you know you got to evaluate. Yes, the buyer has the right to choose, but in this case, it may be. Now, the problem is some agents don't necessarily communicate that properly, and they'll say you must or you're required to use attorney A, Y, and Z.
You know, on a regular
You
transaction,
can't really do that.
on a regular transaction, I've seen these listing agents trying to push a lender too, and strongly, highly suggest you use this lender, which
And
is
they are absolutely allowed to recommend and suggest.
right.
Okay, because it's in their seller's best interest.
They can't force you though.
But they can actually ask you to get pre-approved by a lender if they don't know yours. They can't make you use them.
Right.
But you could write a stip that says, I need you to get pre-approved by this lender to prove that you can buy this house because I'm not taking it off the market for my seller. It's my responsibility to protect my seller. And that's perfectly legal. Now, you can't make the buyer use that closing attorney, lender. But you can at least verify that that lender with the standards that you know says that this buyer can actually purchase this property. Okay? All right. Any other questions about the closing attorney? As another little aside, you read the last sentence, which I always think is kind of funny. If the closing attorney declines such representation, buyer may select a different closing attorney. So if for some reason the closing attorney says, I don't really want to do this, you get to go pick a different one. And you notice that the buyer gets to pick. Okay? All right. Return and disbursement of earnest money. This is an important one to understand. It's an important one to explain to your clients. Because they have to understand that if the contract gets terminated, they're not getting their money that afternoon, right? Because there's some steps that have to be taken and some reality that has to go through in order for that to work. All right. Entitlement to earnest money. Subject to the paragraph below, buyer shall be entitled to earnest money upon, 1, the failure of the parties to enter into a binding agreement. So in other words, if they wrote an earnest money check with the contract and it never goes binding, they get their money back, right? Okay, that's important. Failure of any contingency or condition to which the agreement is subject. Okay. Termination of this agreement due to the default of the seller, or termination of this agreement in accordance with specific right to terminate set forth in the agreement. Otherwise, earnest money shall be applied towards the purchase price of the property at closing, or if other funds are used to pay the purchase price, then earnest money shall be returned to the buyer. Which never happens. They just use it as a credit. Okay? The disbursement of earnest money. It is incredibly important that you understand these paragraphs. Holder shall disburse the earnest money upon 1, the closing of the property, 2, a subsequent written agreement of the buyer and the seller. In the language of termination, what is that called? A T&R. What's T&R stand for?
Termination and release.
Termination and release. So it's a two-part thing. It terminates the contract, but it also releases the earnest money. It must be signed by both parties. The release portion of it, not the necessarily termination, but the release portion of it must be signed by both parties in order for the holder to release the earnest money. Or if there's a court order or arbitrator having jurisdiction over the dispute involving earnest money, or the failure of the parties to enter into binding agreement. Of course, again. In addition, the holder may disperse the earnest money upon a reasonable interpretation of the agreement, provided that the holder first gives all parties at least 10 days notice stating to whom and why the disbursement will be made. Then they can object. If they receive the objection and they change their mind, they have to notify everybody again, give them another 10 days, and so on until at some point they can make a decision to just give the money to who they said they were going to give the money to because they don't agree with the arguments being made. Okay? I will tell you You know, we talked about the fact that attorneys are not likely to make an interpretation of the contract because that's not the world of liability they live in. And so they're going to go straight to interpleading, to court, basically. Whereas brokers are more likely to make an interpretation. I have one right now. I've been talking to the broker on the other side because, to be honest, if I can convince the broker on the other side that I'm right and they're wrong, then they can convince their client to sign the release. It just makes everything easier. But if I can't, I'm still going to do my 10-day letter and say, this is how I read the contract. This is the way it's supposed to go. And then if they want to argue, they can, and we go back and forth and do our thing. Okay? It's also important to note in this section is where it says, if the check is accepted and deposited by the seller, it shall constitute liquidated damages in full settlement of all claims by the seller against the buyer and the brokers in this transaction. In other words, if this earnest money is delivered to the seller and they take it, deposit it, they can't come back and sue the buyer for performance because they've just accepted full liquidity, right? Sue anybody for anything, but technically you're already giving away that right here. Interpleader. If an earnest money dispute cannot be resolved after a reasonable time, holder may interplead the earnest money into a court of competent jurisdiction if the holder is unsure who is entitled to the earnest money. So if I can't make a determination, if it's too fuzzy, then it's going to go to interpleader.
Operative word is may.
May, yes. Don't have to. I can make the decision. But if I don't feel comfortable with the decision, then I'm going to push it off on somebody else. That's kind of the way that works. Mediator, or interpleader, court, something. The last part here, which of course is very important to us as a holder, is indemnification. Basically, if I screw it up, everybody has agreed to indemnify the holder. You can't come after me for the money. Now, I will tell you that doesn't keep people from suing me. As a broker, I've been personally sued for earnest money, which was interesting since I wasn't actually holding it at that time. The attorney was holding it. But I still got sued. And it's just the way of this world. But in all reality, there is a hold harmless paragraph here. Okay? All right. Let's call it good. We'll stop at number 9 because we're pushing into about an hour at this point, right? And we'll come back. I know this stuff is really exhilarating stuff, but it is important. It's extremely important that you understand what you're having your clients sign. You know, depending on your client may need more understanding of this contract than not. You know, some clients are just like, well, where do I sign? And they sign it. And you're like, you really should read that first, you know. It's their responsibility to do so. Other clients are like, okay, I've read the whole thing 4 times, and I have questions about this, this, and this. If you get a client that says, okay, I have questions about this, this, and this, and I really want to change this and this and this, what do you do?
Call you.
You can call me and call the attorney because I'm not making changes to this contract without an attorney's advice, okay, ever. Because we've had some lately where people wanted to scratch paragraphs and change this and that and the other, and it's like, no, this is a standard contract that's written for all realtors in the state of Georgia for residential property sales. This is what we use. We can fill in the blanks because that's what we're allowed to do because we're not attorneys. We can't do anything other than fill in the blanks. If you're going to start scratching stuff out and doing this, that, and the other, we're going to have to get attorneys involved to figure out what it is happening based on what you're doing.
In reality, a special stip is scratching it, though.
It can very much. And when we get to special steps, make sure you're here so we can have good conversation about that. Because special steps are definitely a place where you as an agent can get yourself in trouble. Because you are writing language versus just filling in a blank.
Use the big book.
Okay? And the big book definitely has a big section on that. And when we talk about it, the actual computer has a ton of steps written for you by attorneys.
All right.
All right, good job, guys. We'll see you next week for